3:30 in the morning, June 17th, 1944. There is no light on that plane. There is only a sound. Diesel engines, dozens of them, somewhere out in the dark, starting up together and coming closer. A Marine officer lying in a hole on that line had been told there might be 200 Japanese tanks on this island. Listening to that noise in the blackness, he was certain all 200 of them were coming straight for him. They were not, but close to 40 were. At some point on that island in the fighting that followed, a Japanese tank came through the line at the exact place where 40 men were lying in the dirt. The man who stopped it was not a marksman. He was not a specialist with a bazooka and a perfect shot. He was the lieutenant, their commanding officer, 29 years old. He lived another 67 years after that night. He came home. He married a girl from a small town in Wisconsin. He sold printing for the local newspaper. He was elected mayor twice, and he never told his wife. He never told his 4 children. Not one word. In 66 years. The only reason you are hearing this at all is that a stranger stood up at his funeral and said it out loud. September 2011. Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. A small city on a narrow neck of land where Lake Michigan pushes into the Door Peninsula. Francis Joseph Tachovsky has died at the age of 96. Everyone calls him Frank. He was the mayor here. After that, the postmaster. He chaired the United Way Drive. He golfed. He was the kind of man whose name appears in the community pages for 40 years and never once on the front page. At the memorial service, people stand up and say what people say. He got things done. He knew everyone. He was steady. Then a man named William Parsons walks to the front. Parsons is not family. He is a Sturgeon Bay native, and he does not talk about the mayor or the postmaster or the printing salesman. He talks about 1955. He was 18 years old that year. A freshman at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, enrolled in Naval ROTC. Frank Tachovsky was there too, a much older student on the GI Bill, a man in his 40s sitting in classrooms with teenagers. They spoke because they had both come from the same small town on the same small peninsula. Parsons did not think much of him. An older guy, quiet, polite. Then one day Parsons watched a Marine sergeant see Frank Tachovsky across a room. The sergeant was not a warm man. Parsons remembered him as stoic, the kind of career Marine whose face does not move. And this man saw Tachovsky and lit up like something had been handed back to him. So Parsons asked him, "How do you know Frank?" And the sergeant, whose name was Al Junker, told an 18-year-old kid a story about an island in the Pacific. About a platoon, about a tank in the dark, and about what the lieutenant did. 56 years later, William Parsons is standing at a funeral in Sturgeon Bay, telling that story to a room full of people who had known Frank Tachovsky their entire adult lives. Including his son. Joseph Tachovsky is sitting in that room. He is a grown man. He knew his father had been a Marine. He knew there had been a war in the Pacific, the way you know there was weather in a year you did not live through. He did not know this. He had never known this, because his father never said it. Not at a dinner table. Not on a boat. Not in 50 years. The service ends. People go home. And Joseph Tachovsky cannot get it out of his head. A few days later, he does something that would have been impossible in 1955 and impossible in 1975. He sits down at a computer and types 2 words into a search engine. Tachovsky, Saipan. What comes back is a scan of a magazine page from December 1944, a wartime issue of Leatherneck, the Marine Corps magazine. A correspondent had written a feature about a platoon in the 6th Marine Regiment. The headline called them Tachovsky's Terrors. Underneath the scan, someone had left a note. His name was Chris Tipton. He wrote that this had been his own father's platoon. He wrote that the article was accurate except for a few small things. One of them was the name. Among Marines, he said, they were never called the Terrors. They were called Tachovsky's 40 Thieves. Joseph goes out to the garage. There is a footlocker there. It has sat in that garage for years the way a footlocker sits in a garage. Nobody opened it. There was never a rule about it. There was just an understanding, the kind that forms in a house, where a father does not talk about something, and everyone learns not to ask. He opens it. Inside are letters, documents, awards, medals his children had never seen, and a roster, a single sheet. The Scout and Sniper Platoon, 6th Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division. 40 names. To understand why any of them were on that sheet, you have to go back 2 years and about 4,000 miles west to a coral island barely 2 miles long. November 1943, Tarawa Atoll. The 2nd Marine Division goes ashore on a strip of sand called Bedio. The Navy has shelled it for hours. The planning has been thorough. The confidence is high. The tide is wrong. The landing craft ground on the reef hundreds of yards out, and the Marines have to get out and wade. They wade in water that is chest deep, in the open, in daylight, with nothing to hide behind, and nowhere to go but forward. The Japanese are dug into concrete emplacements they have been building for over a year. Fields of fire cross and overlap. Every yard of that lagoon has been measured in advance. The fighting lasts 76 hours. By the end of it, close to 1,000 Marines are dead. The island is taken. It is barely 2 miles long. And when the officers sit down afterward to work out what happened, they keep arriving at the same answer, and it is not a comfortable one. They did not know where the enemy was. They had aerial photographs. They had charts. They had estimates. What they did not have was one man who had put his hands on that ground before the assault and come back to say what was actually there. So they sent 18-year-olds into a lagoon to find out the hard way. Colonel James P. Risley commands the 6th Marine Regiment. He already has a Scout and Sniper Platoon on his table of organization. Every Marine regiment does. It is a line on a form. What he does not have before Tarawa is a reason to take that line seriously. Tarawa gives him one. The Marine Corps trains excellent riflemen. It trains men to move as a body, to hold a line, to advance on order, to stay together. What Risley needs now is close to the opposite. He needs men who will work alone, past the last friendly position, for stretches at a time with nobody coming if it goes wrong. Men who will make decisions in the dark and not wait for permission. Men who are, in the specific institutional sense of the word, difficult. The officer he hands it to is a first lieutenant named Frank Tachovsky. He is 29 years old. He was born in Pennsylvania in January of 1915. He joined the Marine Corps because it was advertising a $15 enlistment bonus. He kept $5 and mailed 10 of it home to his mother. He was in Iceland before Pearl Harbor, then San Diego, then the Pacific. He had already been at Tarawa. And when he goes looking for the men he wants, he does not go to the rifle ranges or the honor rolls. He goes to the brig. His logic is simple and it does not flatter anybody. 2 Marines get in a fight. One of them wins. One of them loses. The loser is carried to the infirmary. The winner is written up and locked in the brig, because winning a fight is a disciplinary offense. Which means the Marine Corps files a report that identifies with perfect precision which of those 2 men can handle himself. And then it punishes him for it. Tachovsky put it plainly. The guy that wins the fight is thrown in the brig. He read those files as a recruiting list. Understand what that means and what it does not mean. These were not convicts. This is not a story about hardened criminals handed rifles. These were young Marines with black marks for brawling, for insubordination, for the ordinary offenses of young men in a service that was itself very young. What Tachovsky saw in that paperwork was not criminality. It was a documented unwillingness to back down. The Corps called them troublemakers. He wanted about 40 of them. They trained on the big island of Hawaii at a camp the 2nd Marine Division had named after the island that nearly destroyed it. Camp Tarawa. They learned things the rest of the Corps was not taught. How to move through country without leaving a trail. How to watch a position for hours without being seen. How to read a Japanese map and a Japanese document. how to call naval gunfire onto a set of coordinates and then be somewhere else when it landed, and how to kill quietly because a rifle shot behind enemy lines does not just kill a sentry. It announces you. They also learned something the Marine Corps would never print in a manual. They learned to acquire supplies wherever they could. This part is not a legend, though veterans often joked about it. During much of the Pacific War, Marines frequently complained about shortages compared with the Army, and units often scavenged or borrowed equipment from other services whenever possible. So Marines supplemented what they were issued by taking what they were not. The 6th Regiment's Scout and Sniper Platoon became exceptionally good at it. Army supply depots, Navy warehouses, food, clothing, equipment, vehicles. Quartermasters in 2 service branches learned to recognize them coming. The nickname did not come from their commander. It did not come from a war correspondent. It certainly did not come from themselves. It came from other Marines, half in envy and half in complaint. It was what men said about the platoon, that somehow always had better boots than everyone else. The 40 Thieves. The name stuck to them for the rest of their lives. And while those men were learning to disappear into brush on the big island of Hawaii, 1 island away on Maui, a 32-year-old naval officer named Draper Kaufman was teaching a completely different group of volunteers something no Navy on Earth had ever done. He was teaching them to swim onto a defended beach. Not at night, not under cover. In daylight, neither man knew the other existed. In June of 1944, both of them would be sent to the same island, in the same week, against the same 30,000 Japanese defenders. Only one of those 2 units would be remembered as the beginning of something. It was not the one with 40 names on the roster. Saipan is 14 miles long and about 5 miles wide. From the air it looks like farmland because that is mostly what it was. Sugarcane in long green rows. Narrow-gauge rail lines running down to the mills. A town on the west coast called Garapan, with paved streets and shops and a harbor. Roughly 30,000 Japanese troops are waiting on it. And this island is not like the ones that came before. Saipan has been under Japanese administration for 25 years, since the Mandate of 1919. It is not Japanese soil in law. It is Japanese soil in every way that matters to the people living on it. There are Japanese families here. Japanese children in Japanese schools. Japanese graves with Japanese grandparents in them. Which means that for the first time in the Pacific War, American troops are about to land on ground the enemy considers home. Everybody in that invasion fleet has been told what that is likely to mean. June 14th, 1944. 1 day before the landing. 200 swimmers go into the water off the western beaches. They are not carrying rifles. They are wearing swim trunks, canvas shoes, and a face mask. Each man has a knife on his belt and nothing else that can kill anybody. Their bodies are painted, coated blue to disappear into the lagoon, and then marked with black lines around the neck, the chest, the legs at measured intervals, so that when one man stands in shallow water, another man can read the depth right off his body like a ruler. They are dragging weighted fishing line to sound the bottom. They are writing on plexiglass slates tied to their knees. Their commander is Draper Kaufman, 32 years old. Weeks earlier, in a briefing, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had told him what he wanted. Swim in to the beach. Survey the depths, the obstacles, the mines, the gun positions, the surf. Do it at 8. Kaufman assumed he meant 8 at night and asked how much moonlight there would be. Turner told him he meant 8 in the morning. And Kaufman said the only thing a sane man could say, "You don't swim into somebody else's beach in broad daylight, sir." Then he went and did it. They went in under the guns. They measured the reef. They marked the coral heads. They found things that could not be seen from an airplane or a chart or a photograph, and they swam back out and handed it to the men who would land the next morning. Some of them learned in the water that a bullet entering the sea slows down and starts to sink after a few feet. So when the fire came close, they went under and let it pass over them. Nobody had ever carried out this kind of large-scale daylight combat beach reconnaissance before. Every man who has ever earned a SEAL Trident traces his line back through that morning. The 40 thieves knew nothing about any of it. June 15th, 1944, 8:40 in the morning. The 2nd Marine Division goes ashore on the northern beaches. Red 2. Red 3. The 4th Marine Division lands to the south, toward Kanoa. The Japanese had a year to get ready, and they used it the way professionals use it. Every yard of those beaches is surveyed and registered. The mortars are not searching for targets. They are firing on numbers written down months ago. Mount Tapasho stands in the center of the island, 1,500 feet of limestone, and from the top of it a Japanese observer can see every landing craft in the water. Men die in the surf. Men die at the seawall. By nightfall the beachhead is barely a mile deep, and neither division has reached the objectives it was supposed to reach in the first hours. Somewhere in that, 40 men are moving inland ahead of everybody else. That is the job. Get out past the last friendly rifle and keep going. Find the pillboxes, the mortar pits, the artillery, the observation posts. Get the coordinates back. Then be gone before the shells arrive. They work in small teams spread wide, talking with their hands. They do not shoot unless there is no other choice, because a shot behind the line is a signal flare with your name on it. Most of them are barely out of their teens. 6 months earlier a number of them had been locked up for fighting. Now they are past the last friendly position. In ground the main body will not reach for days, counting enemy soldiers. The second night is the one that goes into the histories. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo is on Saipan. The same Nagumo who commanded the carriers at Pearl Harbor. He and Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, 53 years old, look at that beachhead and decide it has to be broken now, tonight, before it hardens into something permanent. Saito issues the order. The 136th Infantry Regiment, the 1st Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force, and Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment. The attack is set for the evening of June 16th. It does not go in on time because the units are scattered and the roads are cut and nothing on that island is working the way it is supposed to. It goes in at about 3:30 in the morning on June 17th. About 37 of the regiment's 44 tanks. It is the largest armored attack Japan ever launched in the Pacific War, and it is aimed directly at the 6th Marine Regiment. The Marines hear them before they see them. Some of the Japanese tanks have infantry riding on the hulls. Some of the crews are blowing bugles. The Marines call for illumination, and the Navy turns on the sky. Star shells burst over the plain, and the darkness is simply taken away, and there they are, out in the open with nowhere to be. Shermans of the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion. Self-propelled guns. Bazookas. 37mm guns firing canister. And on the lighter tanks, 50 caliber machine guns punching straight through armor that was never built to stop them. It lasts hours. When it is over, most of the 9th Tank Regiment is burning on that plain, and Colonel Goto is dead in his command tank. At some point on that island, and we do not know which night because the only man who could have told us never did, a Japanese tank came through the line at the place where the Scout and Sniper Platoon was lying. And it was the lieutenant who stopped it. Sergeant Al Junker was there. Junker is the reason we know anything at all. Frank Tachovsky never told his wife. He never told his 4 children. He let it stay in the box. Organized fighting continued for about 3 more weeks. The island fights as hard as the enemy does. It is June in the Marianas, and the heat sits on a man like a hand. Water runs out. Men drink from streams they know they should not drink from, and dysentery goes through the platoon. Disease, including dysentery and mosquito-borne illnesses, spread through the exhausted Marines. Men are running fevers and still walking because there is nobody to send in their place. They live on what they carry, and then on what they can take. Many lost dramatic amounts of weight during the campaign, some veterans later recalling losses of 30 pounds or more. The Marines grind up the spine of the island, through country that has names now, and every one of those names was paid for. Death Valley, Purple Heart Ridge, Hell's Pocket, Mount Tapasho, the Scouts out ahead, see things the line does not see until later. Wounded Marines left lying in the open, as bait for the men who would come for them. That was a tactic. It worked more than once. They see what happens to prisoners. Now here is the thing nobody bothered to explain to any of them at the time. They were not fighting for Saipan. They were fighting for a runway. There is an airfield on the southern end of the island called a slido, a strip of concrete in a sugarcane field. And it is the entire reason the United States was willing to spend 3,000 American lives on 14 miles of rock. On the same morning, the Marines waded ashore at Saipan. 68 B-29 bombers took off from airfields around Chengdu, in China, and 47 of them bombed a steelworks in southern Japan. That was the alternative. Cost a fortune. Every drop of fuel had to be flown over the Himalayas. And from China, the bombers could only reach the southern island of Kyushu. Tokyo was out of range. From Saipan, it was not. The Marianas were the only islands on Earth that put the Japanese capital under a bomber that could reach it and come home again. The Americans take a slido and rename it Isley Field. The first B-29 lands there in October. The first B-29 strategic bombing mission against Tokyo from the Marianas flew from Saipan on November 24, 1944. On the other side of the world, the men running the Japanese war understand exactly what has happened. Saipan was not an outpost. It was the inner line. It was supposed to hold. On July 18, 1944, 9 days after the island is declared secure, the government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo falls. There is still more than a year of war left. Japan will not surrender for another 13 months. But in Tokyo, in July of 1944, men were looking at a map with a hole in it and they knew. 40 men had spent 18 days crawling through sugarcane counting machine guns, and they knew none of that. They were simply trying to push north until organized resistance ended. That final advance eventually reached the cliffs at Marpi Point. On July 6, 1944, in a cave in the north of Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito wrote a last order to what was left of his command, and then took his own life. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo died the same day. The next morning, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese soldiers came down the Tanapag Plain in the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. Men with rifles, others carrying improvised weapons, including bayonets fixed to poles. Some wounded soldiers even joined the charge. They hit the 105th Infantry Regiment of the Army's 27th Division, and they went through it and they kept going until there was nobody left to keep going. On July 9, 1944, Saipan was declared secure. Secure is a military word. It has a specific meaning, and it is not the same as over. Because that island did not end at a beach. Marpi Point is the northern tip of Saipan. Limestone bluffs standing above the water. There were civilians up there, thousands of them, Japanese families who had lived on that island for a generation. Farmers, shopkeepers, mothers with children on their backs. They had been told what Americans did to prisoners. They had been told it for years, and by the second week of July there was nothing left in their experience to make them doubt it. Marines stood on top of those cliffs with interpreters and loudspeakers and tried to tell them it was not true. It did not work. Whole families went off the edge. Parents went holding their children. The men watching had already been through Tarawa. They had already been through 18 days of Saipan. This is the thing that broke them, and it broke them in a way that never healed because there was nothing to fight and nothing to do and nowhere to point a rifle. They stood there and watched it happen. That is the last image most of them carried off that island. Not the tanks. Not the caves. There was no debriefing. There was a ship and then Tinian in late July and then the war went on. They came home in 1945 and 1946 to a country throwing parades. And most of them said nothing, not out of modesty, because talking about it meant going back to the cliffs, and a man learns very quickly which doors he does not open. Some of them drank. Some of them woke at 3 in the morning for the rest of their lives. Some of them could not hold a marriage together and could not have told you exactly why. There was no name for it in 1946, no diagnosis, no treatment, no claim to file, no group meeting on Thursday nights. There was a handshake, a job, a wife, and an expectation that a man would simply resume. So they resumed. Frank Tachovsky came home. He married Roxana Desonfon, a girl from Sturgeon Bay, whose family owned a hotel there. During Korea, the Marine Corps sent him to Formosa, where he trained Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops in amphibious landings. He used the GI Bill and went to Madison in his 40s and sat in classrooms with 18-year-olds, which is how a boy named William Parsons came to be standing at his funeral half a century later. Then he moved back to Sturgeon Bay and sold printing for the Door County Advocate. He was elected mayor twice. In 1966, he was appointed postmaster, which cost him the mayor's office and the sales job both. He stayed in city affairs anyway. He chaired the United Way Drive. His name turns up in that newspaper for decades the way a man's name turns up when he is the one who gets things done. He eventually retired a colonel. He had a Silver Star. And here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. That Silver Star was for Tarawa. For Saipan, for 18 days out past the line. For the night the tank came through, he received a Bronze Star. The harder thing got the smaller ribbon. That happens more often than people think. Medals are written up by men who saw it happen, and the men working behind the line are, by definition, the ones nobody is watching. He never mentioned either one. Now the other thread, those swimmers, the 200 men who went into the water off Saipan in trunks, and a face mask did not stop there. Kaufman's teams went on to Tinian, then Guam, then Leyte and Lingayen Gulf, then Iwo Jima, where the gunboats covering their swim drew such heavy fire that the Japanese gave away positions they had spent months hiding. Then Okinawa, where nearly 1,000 of them worked the reefs. And when it was over, Underwater Demolition Team men were among the first Americans to set foot on the Japanese home islands. The Navy kept them, through Korea, into the 60s, and in January of 1962, the Navy stood up 2 new units drawn from those frogmen and named them 4 where they were expected to operate. Sea, land. Modern Navy SEALs trace much of their lineage through the wartime underwater demolition teams, whose combat reconnaissance at Saipan became one of the key milestones in that evolution because an admiral would not take no for an answer. That is the honest lineage. It is not the 40 thieves. It never was. Which brings us to the question of how any of this survived at all. Because it very nearly did not. Frank Tachovsky told nobody. If the story had depended on him, it would have gone into the ground with him in September of 2011. It depended instead on a chain of accidents. Sergeant Al Junker told it once in 1955 in a room in Madison to an 18-year-old kid from the same small town who happened to ask a question. William Parsons carried it for 56 years and had no particular reason to expect he would ever use it. Then he stood up at a funeral and said it out loud in a room that happened to contain a son who had never heard a word of it. Pull out any one of those links and there is nothing. If Junker stays quiet, if Parsons never asks, if Parsons is not at the funeral, if Joseph is not listening that day, nothing. Instead, Joseph Tachovsky spent 9 years finding the men who were still alive. Montana, Arizona, Georgia, West Virginia, old men now in towns you cannot fly into directly. He said something about them that is worth repeating. That their whole lives they had been trying to forget the horror of it. But as frail old men, that was not how they wanted to be remembered. Which brings us to a farmhouse in the mountains of Gifu Prefecture, Japan. In 1944, a young Marine named Marvin Strombo got separated from his squad in the fighting outside Garapan. The other 5 men had moved on without him. He was alone behind the line, scanning the ground, and he saw a body. A Japanese soldier lying on his left side. No blood on him. No wounds Strombo could find. He looked, Strombo said, like he was asleep. Something white was showing at the man's chest. It was a silk flag, a rising sun in the center, and every inch of white around it covered in calligraphy. Strombo reached for it, and his hand stopped. He knew what it was. He knew what it had meant to the man lying there. And then he took it because he understood that if he did not, somebody else would, and it would be gone from the world entirely. He carried it home to Oregon. It hung in a glass-fronted gun cabinet for decades. His 4 children grew up walking past it. He never explained it. He never talked about Tarawa or Saipan or Tinian either. He tried once to find out who it belonged to. He wrote letters. He did not read Japanese. It was long before the internet, and there was nowhere for those letters to go, and eventually he put it down. Then, in 2012, the son of his old commanding officer called him about a book he was writing. Through that, Strombo reached an organization in Oregon called the Oban Society, which does one thing. It returns flags. Within a week, researchers read the writing on the silk and gave him a name, Sadao Yaju, the eldest of 6 children, from a tea-growing village of about 2,400 people in the mountains west of Tokyo. He had gone to war in 1943. The calligraphy was the signatures of 180 friends and neighbors who came to see him off. 42 of them were his own relatives. 7 of those people were still living. When the researchers reached Yaju's brother by telephone, he asked whether the man who had the flag was the same man who found it. There was silence on the line. Then he asked whether that man might know how his brother died, and where. Because in 70 years nobody had ever told that family anything. No remains, no account, just a name that stopped. Marvin Strombo was the only person alive on Earth who could answer that. He was 93 years old. He got on a plane and flew 10,000 miles. On August 15, 2017, 72 years to the day, after Japan's surrender, during Oban, the festival when Japanese families welcomed their dead back home, Strombo walked into a room in the village of Higashishirakawa. Tatsuya Yaju was 89. 2 of his sisters were there. Strombo gave them the flag, and then he did the harder thing. He told them where he had found their brother. He told them the ground and the direction. He told them it had been a mortar round, and that it had been quick. An old man in Wisconsin who never spoke. An old man in Oregon who kept a promise nobody ever heard him make. They were called Thieves. Their own side gave them that name, half in envy and half in complaint, and they carried it the rest of their lives. The only thing one of them ever truly took, he gave back.